What is this transaction?
It was just groceries. It was just groceries, Terrence.
Groceries don't cost $300.
I'm tired of this.
Every single night at exactly 9 o'clock, Renee Anderson sat down across from her husband at their kitchen table in Charlotte, North Carolina, and handed him her phone. Not for a conversation. Not for connection. For an audit. Terrence Anderson would scroll through her banking app line by line, cross-referencing every purchase against a stack of receipts he required her to keep, asking her to explain a $4 coffee, a $14 lunch, a purchase she'd made 11 days earlier that he claimed not to remember approving. It had been going on for 2 years. It had gotten so unbearable that Renee had started keeping a second phone, hidden in a shoebox at the back of her closet, just so she could have a single account, a single dollar, that belonged entirely to her. What Terrence didn't know, what he wouldn't find out until the night everything finally changed, was that his wife had spent the last 6 months quietly building a life he could no longer touch, no matter how many receipts he demanded to see. Before we get into how Renee finally took her power back, if you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because these stories only get more powerful from here. Give this video a like if you're rooting for her already, share it with a woman in your life who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below with the time and the city you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love seeing exactly how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the beginning, to understand exactly how a marriage that once felt like partnership slowly became something Renee Anderson had to escape from her own kitchen table. Renee Anderson grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, the oldest of 3 daughters raised by a single mother who worked as a school administrator and drilled one lesson into her girls above almost everything else. A woman should always keep something of her own money, her own name on something, her own way out if she ever needed one. Renee took that lesson seriously. She earned a marketing degree from North Carolina State, built a solid 10-year career climbing from junior coordinator to marketing manager at a mid-sized regional firm. And by the time she met Terrence Anderson at a mutual friend's dinner party, she was earning $78,000 a year, had her own condo, her own car paid off in full, and a savings account she'd built entirely herself, dollar by careful dollar. Since her first job out of college, Terrence worked in corporate finance, sharp and detail-oriented in exactly the way his profession demanded, the kind of man who could explain compound interest at a dinner party in a way that somehow made it sound romantic instead of tedious. He was attentive early on, genuinely interested in Renee's career, asking thoughtful questions about her campaigns, her clients, the specific strategy behind decisions other men in her life had usually found too boring to ask about at all. Renee married 2 years after she met Terrence, in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside Charlotte, her mother crying through most of the vows, not from sadness, Renee would later remember her saying, but from the particular pride of watching a daughter she'd raised to be fiercely self-sufficient choose, of her own free will, to build a life alongside someone. Renee kept working for the first year of their marriage, exactly as she'd always planned to. She had no intention of giving up the career, or the independence, her mother had spent her whole childhood teaching her to protect. She didn't yet understand that Terrence had a very different plan in mind, one he'd introduced slowly enough that she wouldn't fully recognize it until she was already deep inside it. The first conversation about Renee leaving her job happened 18 months into the marriage, framed, as Terrence framed almost everything in those early days, as pure practicality rather than control. "My bonus this year alone covers more than your entire salary," he told her one evening, not unkindly, laying out a spreadsheet he'd built comparing her income to his own. "If you stayed home, we'd save on daycare when we eventually have kids, we'd save on your commute costs, your work wardrobe, all of it. Financially, it just makes more sense for one of us to focus entirely on the household." Renee resisted at first. She loved her career. She loved the specific, particular pride of building something with her own name attached to it. But Terrence was patient, persistent, and increasingly persuasive over the following months, framing every argument around family, around efficiency, around a future version of their life together that sounded, on paper, genuinely appealing. She quit her job 8 months later, 2 years into the marriage, taking what Terrence called a well-deserved break, that both of them, at the time, genuinely believed would eventually lead back to her career once they built more financial stability as a family. It never did. Instead, within 3 months of Renee leaving her job, Terrence restructured their finances entirely, closing the joint checking account they'd shared since the wedding and replacing it with a system he called, at first, simplified household budgeting. Renee would receive a set weekly allowance, transferred into an account Terrence could monitor in real time through a shared banking app. Any purchase outside that allowance required his approval first, submitted through a request he'd review, he said, when he had a chance. It's not about control, Renee, he told her, the first time she raised a concern. It's about us being on the same page financially, since you're not bringing in income right now. I need visibility into where our money's going. Any reasonable partner would understand that. Renee, 6 months removed from her own paycheck and increasingly unsure of her financial footing, told herself he was right. What began as Terrence reviewing the shared banking app, when he had a chance, slowly calcified, over the following year, into a nightly ritual that Renee came to dread more than almost anything else in her day. Every evening at 9 o'clock, without exception, Terrence would sit her down at the kitchen table and go through her spending from that day, line by line. A coffee purchase required an explanation. A lunch with her sister required a receipt, kept and presented, along with a justification for why Renee had needed to eat out instead of using groceries already in the house. A birthday gift for her mother required advance approval that Terrence sometimes granted and sometimes, without much explanation, simply denied. I bought Mama a birthday gift last week, Renee told her sister Michelle, during one of their increasingly rare, increasingly careful phone calls. $40, Michelle. He made me sit there for 20 minutes explaining why she needed a gift that specific year, like I hadn't bought her a birthday present every single year of my entire life. Michelle, who'd noticed the changes in her sister over the past year, but hadn't fully understood their scope until that conversation, went quiet for a long moment. Renee, that's not budgeting. That's control. I need you to hear the difference, because I don't think you're seeing it clearly anymore. Renee brushed the comment off at the time, the same way she'd brushed off a dozen similar comments over the previous year, from her sister, from her mother, from the one close friend who still occasionally, carefully, asked how things were going at home. She told herself Terrence loved her. She told herself this was simply what partnership looked like when one person managed the finances more carefully than the other. She told herself a great many things over that year, specifically so she wouldn't have to sit with the actual truth of what her nightly kitchen table ritual had become. The turning point, though Renee didn't fully recognize it as one at the time, came 14 months into this new financial arrangement, on an ordinary Tuesday when Terrence denied her request for money to replace a pair of work shoes that had finally, after years of wear, split entirely at the sole. You don't need new shoes, Renee. You're not working. Wear the black ones for now, and we'll revisit it next month if it's really necessary. Renee stood in their bedroom that night, staring at a shoe with a sole flapping loose, feeling something shift inside her that she couldn't fully name yet, but that felt distinctly like the first real crack in 2 years of slowly, carefully talking herself out of her own instincts. She thought about her mother's voice, the same lesson repeated so many times throughout her childhood it had become almost background noise. A woman should always keep something of her own. The next morning, while Terrence was at work, Renee drove to a store across town, paid cash for a basic prepaid phone, and opened a bank account at a credit union Terrence had never heard of, using her maiden name on the paperwork wherever the form allowed it. She hid both items in a shoebox at the back of her closet, behind a row of shoes Terrence never bothered to inventory, because inventorying her closet had never once occurred to him as something worth controlling. It wasn't a plan yet. It was, at that point, simply the smallest possible act of keeping something for herself, a single hidden account with $40 in it, quietly deposited from grocery money she'd carefully, invisibly saved over several weeks by buying slightly less than her allowance technically allowed for. It was the first decision Renee had made entirely on her own in over a year. It felt, she'd later say, like remembering how to breathe after holding her breath for longer than she'd realized. Over the following 6 months, Renee built something Terrence had no idea existed. using every skill from her decade-long marketing career that 2 years of financial dependence hadn't managed to erase. She started freelance marketing consulting work, quietly for small local businesses who needed help with social media strategy and basic campaign work. Work she could do from her phone, in short bursts, during the hours Terrence was at the office, invoiced under her maiden name to the hidden credit union account, paid an amount small enough never to trigger any alert on the joint account Terrence actually monitored. Her first client was a small bakery 2 neighborhoods over, run by a woman named Yolanda who'd posted in a local community group looking for help growing her Instagram presence. Renee handled the entire project through a library computer, careful never to leave a trace on any device Terrence had access to, and earned $300 for 2 weeks of work. The first money she'd earned entirely by herself in over 2 years. She sat in her car outside that library afterward and cried. Not from sadness, but from something closer to relief, remembering exactly who she used to be before 2 years of nightly audits had slowly convinced her that woman had disappeared for good. Word spread slowly among small business owners in Charlotte who needed affordable, skilled marketing help. Within 4 months, Renee had 6 regular clients and was earning close to $2,000 a month, entirely hidden, entirely her own, growing steadily in an account Terrence Anderson had absolutely no knowledge of. One client in particular, a woman named Denise who ran a small hair salon in East Charlotte, became more than just an invoice on Renee's growing spreadsheet. Denise had built her salon from nothing after her own divorce 8 years earlier, and over several months of working together, she became the first person Renee told even a partial version of the truth to. Not the full story of the nightly audits, not yet, but enough to let Denise understand why Renee insisted on cash payments sometimes, why she never gave out her real last name on invoices, why she always seemed to be watching the clock when their meetings ran past a certain hour. "You don't have to tell me everything, baby," Denise told her one afternoon, after Renee had stayed 40 minutes past their scheduled meeting time, helping restructure the salon's entire social media calendar. "But I've seen that look on a woman's face before. Whatever you're building on the side, you keep building it. Don't you let anybody talk you out of it." Those words stayed with Renee through the following months. Through nights she sat across from Terrence at the kitchen table pretending everything in her financial life still fit neatly inside the box he thought he'd built around her. She also, during those 6 months, quietly consulted an attorney, a family law specialist named Diane Cortez, recommended by Michelle, whom Renee met during appointments scheduled under the guise of doctor's visits Terrence never questioned closely enough to verify. Diane walked Renee through exactly what financial documentation she'd need if she eventually decided to leave, exactly what North Carolina law said about marital assets, and exactly how to protect the income Renee was quietly building without it being classified as marital property Terrence could later claim any right to. "You're not just building money, Renee," Diane told her, during one of those careful, quiet meetings. "You're building proof. Proof of your own capability. That matters just as much as the dollar amount, when the time comes." The nightly audits continued throughout those 6 months, exactly as they always had. Terrence scrolling through the joint account, questioning every purchase, entirely unaware that an entirely separate financial life had grown quietly alongside the one he monitored so closely. The night everything changed began exactly like every other night had for the past 2 years. 9 o'clock. The kitchen table. Terrence's hand extended for Renee's phone. Except this time, Renee didn't hand him the phone she'd been using for 2 years, the one connected to the joint account and its careful, monitored allowance. She placed a folder on the table instead. "What's this?" Terrence asked, genuine confusion crossing his face. 6 months of invoices, Renee said, her voice steadier than she'd expected it to be, given how many times she'd rehearsed this exact moment in her head over the preceding weeks. "From clients. My clients, Terrence. I've been running a marketing consulting business for 6 months, and I've earned $11,400, every cent of it in an account you don't have access to and never will." Terrence's face moved through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally, something closer to genuine anger, though Renee noticed, watching him carefully, that underneath the anger sat something that looked almost like fear. "You've been hiding money from me? For 6 months? Renee, that's deceptive. That's not how a marriage is supposed to work." "You're right," Renee said. It's not how a marriage is supposed to work. Neither is sitting me down every single night for 2 years to interrogate a $4 coffee purchase like I'm a suspect in my own household. Neither is denying me new shoes when mine were falling apart. I didn't hide this money from you because I wanted to deceive you, Terrence. I hid it because I needed to remember, somewhere, that I was still capable of taking care of myself. You'd made me forget that for 2 years straight. Terrence sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the folder of invoices, at 6 months of evidence that his wife had rebuilt an entire private financial life directly under a system he'd been certain was airtight. I did all of this to protect our family, he finally said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier certainty. I grew up watching my parents fight about money constantly, Renee. I swore I'd never let that happen in my own marriage. I thought if I managed everything carefully enough, tracked everything closely enough, I could make sure we never ended up like them. I understand where that fear came from, Renee said, and she meant it genuinely, having spent enough of the past 6 months in quiet reflection with Diane Cortez to understand that Terrence's control hadn't emerged from nowhere. But Terrence, protecting a family and controlling a spouse are not the same thing, even if they sometimes start from the same fear. You didn't build a partnership with me. You built a system to monitor me, and somewhere along the way, I stopped being your wife in your eyes and started being a line item you needed to audit. So what happens now? Terrence asked quietly, and for the first time in over 2 years, Renee heard something in his voice that sounded less like control, and more like genuine uncertainty about his own behavior. Now, Renee said, you have a choice to make. We go to real counseling, together, with someone who specializes in exactly this dynamic, and you do the actual work of understanding why control started to feel like love to you. Or I take the $11,400 I built entirely on my own, and everything Diane Cortez has already helped me prepare, and I leave. Those are the only 2 options on this table tonight, Terrence. I'm done pretending there's a third one where nothing changes. Terrence chose counseling. Genuinely, Renee would come to believe over the following months, rather than as a strategic move to avoid losing her entirely. Their first several sessions were difficult, marked by Terrence's slow, uncomfortable recognition of exactly how deeply his own childhood fears had reshaped his marriage into something closer to surveillance than partnership. Their therapist, a marriage counselor in Charlotte named Dr. Patricia Reyes, who specialized specifically in financial control dynamics within marriages, helped Terrence trace his behavior back to specific memories of his own parents' financial chaos. Memories he'd never fully processed before simply reenacting a version of control in his own marriage instead. During one particularly difficult session, roughly 2 months in, Dr. Reyes asked Terrence to describe, in detail, a specific childhood memory of his parents fighting about money. Terrence, visibly uncomfortable, described being 11 years old, hiding at the top of the stairs, listening to his father accuse his mother of hiding grocery receipts, of lying about a $20 purchase. The exact same accusatory tone Terrence would later, without ever consciously connecting the 2 moments, use against Renee at their own kitchen table 3 decades later. I became my father, Terrence said quietly, near the end of that session, the realization visibly landing on him in real time. I spent my whole life terrified of becoming him, and somewhere along the way, I did it anyway, just with spreadsheets instead of shouting. Renee, for her part, made clear from the very first session that the nightly audits were over permanently, regardless of what Terrence's therapy eventually uncovered about their origins. She restructured their finances herself, this time, insisting on separate individual accounts alongside a joint account for shared expenses, each of them retaining full autonomy over their own income without requiring the other's approval for ordinary purchases. She also, 6 weeks into counseling, restarted her marketing career formally, taking on her consulting clients as an official, registered business rather than a hidden shoebox operation, eventually renting a small shared office space downtown that had nothing whatsoever to do with Terrence's approval or awareness. Renee Anderson's consulting business, 1 year after that kitchen table conversation, has grown to 14 regular clients and revenue exceeding $90,000 annually, more notably than her original marketing manager salary had ever paid her. She and Terrence remain married, having done the genuinely difficult work of rebuilding their partnership on entirely different terms than the ones it had quietly calcified into during those 2 controlling years. The nightly 9 o'clock ritual at the kitchen table still exists, in a sense, though it looks nothing like it once did. These days, it's simply the time Renee and Terrence sit together to talk about their respective days. No receipts required, no phones handed over for inspection, just 2 people checking in with each other the way partners are actually supposed to. Renee still keeps the shoebox, tucked in the back of her closet, though it's empty now, the prepaid phone and hidden account long since replaced by an entirely legitimate, entirely visible financial life she built and rebuilt on her own terms. She keeps it, she says, as a reminder, not of what Terrence once did, but of exactly what she was still capable of doing for herself. Even during the 2 years she'd nearly forgotten that capability existed at all. My mother always told me to keep something of my own, Renee said, in a conversation she later gave permission to share as part of this story. I used to think she meant money, specifically. I understand now she meant something bigger than that. She meant keeping the part of yourself that knows exactly what you're capable of, even when somebody else is working very hard to convince you otherwise.
If you're watching this, I'd love to get to know you. Please comment your location and the time below. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for being here today.